Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Elephant TV. Today I'll be chatting with Darius Okolla. Darius Okolla is an economist, writer in our dailies, a curator at the Elephant, and a social commentator, among many other things. Today we'll be discussing about the hustler narrative, trying to unpack this notion of the hustler narrative and what exactly it means in light of the current political climate, even as we gear towards 2022. So just to introduce my guest, Karibu Darius.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe, for having me on the Elephant TV to just be able to discuss this critical conversation that is part of our core narratives right now in the country.
Great. I mean, just to get us starting, I mean, I've been really intrigued about, the idea or the notion of a hustler. I know that there are many people in both sides trying to define it as a with the Oxford Dictionary, which I think is, to my mind, it's a bit off the field. But I don't know if you just kindly really articulate to us where this hustler narrative started from, its origins, and how it has come to really capture a faction of Kenya's public imagination.
Well, thank you, Joe. I think one of the bigger conversations that around this narrative that we are supposed to have is the fact that the conversation or the question of who is a hustler really depends on who you ask, because the street vendor, the fruit vendors who consider themselves hustlers, the graduates who have not been able to land themselves, a particular job, consider themselves hustlers. And across the spectrum, it's a term that has always been used to denote in many different contexts, as you've mentioned. There's some of them who will talk about it in the context of, a dictionary, which, to be fair, is, has a bit of truth in it. But in the wider spectrum of things, a hustler is simply anyone who considers themselves in a space where they have to use a bit of street smarts brain and sometimes brawn to be able to make a living or get themselves some resources here and there, especially in the urban spaces. But also we have to go back and realize that the term hustler comes in at a particular point in this country. So in the wider conversation, you start from, let's say, in the 80s. You have a political economy that is, absorbing a lot of the graduates that are coming out of our schooling system. But then you get to the late 80s, early 90s, the full effects of the structural adjustment programs are here, and people need to be able to find a way to fend for themselves outside of the political economy, which by and large has become exhausted at this point. It cannot absorb as many younger people, as it's producing, a number of younger people who are turning 18 at this point. So you have a whole bunch of younger people who get into all kinds of, economic activities and economic ventures. And this coupled with the fact that at this point, the influences of, the Western music begins to come in, the Channel O's and all these other productions. And so hustle becomes your way of trying to make a living without, being strictly embedded into, what you'd call the corporate ladder or the corporate journey as we understand it, or the civil service structure. So being out there in the streets, trying to use your smarts and your skills to be able to get an income was or is what became the hustler. And by and large, also, this can be tied to what you call the ridiculous generation, who at some point, the kids of the 90s who bear the full brand of the structural adjustment programs as it started in the 80s. So in many ways, you have a confluence of things. The colonial political economy becomes exhausted. A lot of kids are still turning 18, becoming eligible to work, and cannot be absorbed either by the official formal sector, as we call it, neither by the government or the civil service or the public service, the wider public service as we know it. And so in the process of trying to create economic meaning for themselves in this colonial economy, in this exhausted colonial economy, and still within urban spaces, then you have what you call the rise, or what we can call the rise of, the hustler generation or the hustler cluster. And this also speaks into a wider class conversation, because one of the things that happens in the 90s is with the structural adjustment programs happening, a lot of these younger people, and they watch their parents lose their economic mobility, their social mobility in that space, and so it almost becomes the initial sort of expansion of and inadvertently the expansion of the economic space away from both the government and the formal sector as we've known them for decades.
Yeah. Right. Hey, thanks. I think that really ties into, particularly when you mentioned the ridiculous generation, which is actually, the deputy president. He's part of that generation, where a generation that has to do their 30-year careers has been hasn't been the professional life, climbing the ladder kind of thing. You are in and out of jobs and you're doing side hustles, that kind of thing. But my next question would be then, in 2020, why is the narrative resonating with Kenyans, in particular, the younger generations, the millennial generation, and what people may call the Gen Zs? Why is there such a resonance with this narrative, with the younger generation?
There are a number of ways to look at that. One of them is the fact that the average Kenyan is 19 years old. The same average Kenyan, in the wider scheme of our economic, or rather educational mobility, about 50% of those who graduate from primary school do not advance to secondary school. That has happened for so many years along the way, despite the what you'd call the initiative to try and have a full enrollment across board. So you leave 50% of your class back. You get to Form 4, only about 3% qualify to go into the university. So you have this, what you'd call the tyranny of the 3%. Mm-hmm. What happened to the other 97%? Most of them are still young. Their education ends at around 15, 16, 17 years of age. And then they have 2 years at home, or a year or two at home, and then they start working. And so you have a young population that, as in a country where the average income is about 13,000 shillings a month, mm-hmm. where 900,000 young people turn 18 every year and are eligible to work, and a fair share of whom are looking for work. Joe, you look at our demographic structure, and one of the things you realize very quickly is that you have a country of about 50 million. About 28 million of these are eligible to work. Only about 15 million are working. So you have about 13 million people out there who are not economically active. Now, you can disaggregate that in whichever way. You can say right. A certain number have retired. A certain number are in the student population and are not necessarily looking for work. A certain number, say, are subsisting, are not seeking any particular economic engagement outside of, the home and their farms. So they're a bit agrarian in their model of sustenance. You can continue to disaggregate that, but even at the end, you're still left with a significant cluster of young, you'd say frustrated people who are looking for work, who are trying to eke an economic living for themselves in conditions that are pretty tough in a country where our public social services don't work. So a lot of these things are privatized, and there's a lot of inefficiency and high charges in there. Right. So this is the cluster that looks at the hustler narrative and realizes this really is about me. This is the one moment I'm getting a voice. And there's an interesting way of looking at it, Joe, and that is the fact that class struggle, this hustler narrative does not just resonate with this huge number of young people. What happens is these young people have been having this conversation for quite a while, but then it had a social grounding in itself, in the music they listened to, in the street use of the word, the narrative hustler. It had economic sense in terms of how they worked in the informal economy, the street vendors, the food vendors, the mkokoteni guys.
The proverbial side hustle.
People. Yeah, the proverbial, what you would call the side hustle, So the hustler narrative already had a social currency and a social traction. It had an economic traction already in the streets. It had an intellectual traction, considering about 2 years ago, early in 2018, we did what you'd call the Millennial series, right here, The Elephant. And it is one of those very consequential editions that was at The Elephant. And, It was simply the millennial generation saying, hey, look, stop trying to throw this stereotype at us. We are already adults. We can understand our situation and we can articulate it and we can own, our identity and our narratives. And we are actually in a space where we are able to, create a generational solidarity thanks to social media. And so we owned that conversation. So the hustler narrative, what is happening right now and what is, sort of making it look like it's a whole new thing is the fact that the politicians are now giving it political language. Otherwise, every other aspect, the economic language has already been given. The social language for hustler narrative had already been given. The intellectual one and even the generational one had already been done. So what we are only seeing to this end is now the political, narrative, the political terminology is coming into, giving the hustler narrative, so to speak, a political language and a certain political legitimacy. Otherwise, there's nothing new about this hustler movement and hustler narrative. Yeah.
Interesting. I think that this brings me to a different conversation. Then, I mean, if you're saying that the ground was already laid, was already fertile, so the vice president and his political faction have just grabbed this fertile ground and run with it. Then it presents a question then on Kenya's economic blueprint, which I, as you so rightly said, the political economy of Kenya. So my question would be then, if what is it about Kenya's economic blueprint that lends itself to creating these conditions of the hustler and the hustler narrative, etc. What does that journey look like to get here?
The journey getting here is, you have a political economy that, basically was supposed to raise a black aristocracy to take over from the white aristocracy somewhere around in 1963, basically. Because from 1885, what you've had is a white aristocracy ruling the country with a few chiefs and colonial and all these hangers-on and traitors. But then they figure out they have to leave. So if they're going to leave, they raise a black aristocracy and then they tell us, you're giving you independence. But what they're actually doing is they're simply changing the colors of the colonial chiefs, from white to black. Sort of, you take colonialism and the colonial racism from an in-your-face kind of colonial racism into some kind of, into the structure. So it stops being blatant, it becomes systemic, such that somebody needs to look a little bit harder to be able to see that this colonial racism never really ended. It's just colonialism getting shrewd or smarter, depending on how you look at it. And so because of that, this system has always been built around exclusion. We never went to school to get employable, to understand the society, or to transform it in any fundamental way.
Right.
We went to school so that you could be given certain certifications, which become a social and intellectual signal that you had been prepared well enough to fit into the colonial economy that had been left post-1963.
Right.
But then, along the way, what happens is that system can only accommodate so many people. I mean, a lot of these chiefs already in and of themselves are 34, 36, 40 wives, a whole bunch of hundreds of kids out there.
Right.
So within 2 generations, you've already exhausted the number of slots you can tokenize. These, if I could call them modern day home guards, and then
the chiefs and their children.
Yeah, the chiefs and their children. Now, the problem is even the children of the peasants are also going to school. And
absolutely,
that is one of the biggest mistakes, quote unquote mistakes Kibaki made, is that he allowed the sons of the peasants to go to university. And so they get there, they can see these opportunities. And so there's a transformation that happens to them. They realize, education creates a certain level of expectation and entitlement. You think, I've gotten these skills, I deserve a certain level of work. I deserve a certain level of economic and professional engagement. It's the same thing that happens to black soldiers who go to fight in India for the queen. And then they come back, they realize also these colonialists can bleed, they can run, they're scared of bullets like everybody else. They're not the gods they presented themselves to be. So that kind of racial transformation also happens locally, but now it happens in terms of social transformation.
Right.
But then the system can't absorb these people. So the rise of what you'd call the informal sector, or what we call the hustle economy, both socially and economically, is almost what you'd say a rebellion against the constraining realities of the political economy that was inherited from from the Wazungus. Now Kibaki worsens it. He opens up this, in a good way. He opens up this space where, you have module 2 generations. Of course, there's a lot to be said about the quality of education that was provided, but generally by numbers, the 20 to 45, 48 generation is the most educated class in the country right now. And a lot of these come from all classes. And then you add in the power of social media, where in times past, if you fell out at, let's say, class 8, you are supposed to, become socially invisible, disappear, go become a farmhand somewhere, don't show up in, these meaningful conversations. If you faded out at, Form 4, we could tokenize you a bit, but also don't try raise your profile. But right now, you are able to keep tabs on, each other. You have primary school friends, you have high school friends. Social media and the expansion of higher education in Kenya expanded the social and intellectual class in this country in a way that cut across class regions, and in a way that ensured that people who were supposed to fade out and become socially invisible suddenly became visible and demanding better than what they've seen before. And that, of course, is a huge, huge challenge for the political economy as it was, because it's never wanted to reform anyway. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, which brings me to, I think, one of my last questions is that now we are here, we're in 2020, months, less than 2 years to the elections. The House narrative is here with us. But I think importantly is the question, which is even moving beyond, I think, the current political stalemate, is how then do we fix our political economy, and particularly what kind of economic blueprint do we need to make more hustlers, to make more hustlers less hustlers? What do we need to do about that?
Well, there are a number of ways of looking at that. One of the ways to go about it is, here's how would look at it generally. Kibaki's job was to raise a generation of graduates, all through from some people in the 90s who had never gotten a university education who were able to get it, and college education who were able to get that.
Absolutely.
And then there's a whole younger generation also who come of age when he's the president and get into the system and they get all this education. But then that also moves, further ahead, and a lot of these kids were not able to graduate soon enough to take advantage of the economic spoils that Kibaki created, or rather the Kibakinomics created. The expansion in the motorcycle industry, the ICT sector, the banking system, the telecommunication systems. There are all these industries that expanded, then higher education. And so, but Kibaki was only in power for 10 years. So by the time a lot of them are graduating, he's on the tail end of his regime. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, there's the 2007 post-election violence, which affected how the economy functioned after that. You remember, it moves from 7.1% growth to 1.7%, actually a complete reversal, And so what happens is whoever was to take over from President Kibaki in 2013, their one primary job was to create economic opportunity for an entire generation that suddenly had been given education and exposure and raised expectations, and who had, for a moment in the history of this country, realized that this thing can actually work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so what you have here is, you come into 2013, one of the easiest ways to go about this was, and it's something part of the realizations in 2007, which was the fact that we need to decentralize this country. We need to push both economic, social, and cultural fortunes away from the center.
And
this
political.
Idea of the winner takes all, everything is concentrated in one city. You have 15-20% of your GDP in one economy, in one county, and this county is not even very functional. Going by the fact that almost 60% of its 3 million plus residents live in informal settlement. Mm-hmm. There was a need, and there's still a need to push these outwards. once the political economy inherited from the white settler colonialists became exhausted, and this was as far back in the 90s, you could only create so many stopgap measures along the way before you made a major reform to it.
Mm-hmm.
The major reform here that would engender the kind of economic blueprint that you've highlighted would have been to open up northern Kenya, and opening up northern Kenya, which would have meant basically move the economy away from the lunatic express. Along the way, we've always built this kind of an economy that is centered 100 kilometers on both sides of the old
chlorophyll zone
line from. Yeah. We needed to move the economy away from that, because no economic blueprint is large enough to socially transform and economically transform an entire generation.
Absolutely.
Without taking into account certain existential realities and existential opportunities. And one of them was simply decentralize everything. Devolution did part of that job. It pushed some of the resources to the ground and pushed some of this focus to some of these counties. Of course, it's been a mixed bag of legacy in the first 2 terms, but still it did a bit of work. The other one, of course, was fundamentally opening up northern Kenya, and LAPSET was one of those programs that, could have done that very well, a complete overhaul of northern Kenya, open up the roads, build the schools, build the dams. We have about 3 major aquifers in the north who could supply a lot of water to take care of a lot of these things. It will have helped solve the land question, away from the chlorophyll zone. It will have opened up the economy in such a way that it will have created opportunities for a huge segment of the population. But also, it's not just an economic blueprint. It will have forced us to confront certain social, ethnic, and cultural stereotypes and realities. If you're going north, then you'll have to start having conversations about the identity of the Somali communities.
Precisely.
And how some of these things have been treated. It will bring up conversations around things like Wagala, which is
Northern Frontier District.
The Northern Frontier District, the shifter wars and everything
Precisely.
that happened there. The identity of, some of the minority tribes in the north, the Munyoyas and the James, who, we call them in our constitution, the others. We'll have to discuss that othering of these communities. Once we have to build a highway through their neighborhoods, you can no longer other them, because one of the principles of othering them has always been the neglect of the Northern Frontier District. You never had to address them. So it will have caused, or it will have brought about certain positive development, not just economically in terms of infrastructural expansion. It will have also brought conversations around identity, both ethnic, communal identities, but also individual identities, and the space of, a whole lot of other resource issues and historical issues in the north, which so far we've been able to simply gloss over or ignore altogether. So that would have been one of the fundamental aspects to go about it. Yeah.
Thanks. That's really good. So my last question, I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately. Fortunately to some people, unfortunately, that this conversation is within the what we call the Tanga function, Deputy President Ruto, and there are those who feel it's just another political rhetoric to gain power. But either way, it's not my concern here. But how then, if this is a very important conversation, how then do we move it away from not Deputy President Ruto, but how do we move it from just the 2022 elections to it being a mainstay in Kenya's public sphere, such that we're able to shape public policy, social policy, economic policy, but also even just to create a more holistic society where that the people who have been left behind, it becomes a mainstay within our politics. How do we move? What are the steps we need to take as a society?
There are a number of ways we could go about that. And also just before addressing that, also going north would have also connected us to certain aspects of northern frontier, that's southern Ethiopia, the Jubaland in Somalia. On the other side, we have South Sudan, still in the early stages of economic development. We have a whole swath of land and then communities in northern Uganda. And so you have all these communities around there whose that kind of an expansion or a decentralization of Kenyan, not just economics, but a Kenyan reality
Right.
would have really, accounted for a lot and even improved some of our diplomatic and cross-border engagements. So how do we, coming to this question, how do we then begin to move this conversation away from a few political,
precisely.
characters and, within 2 years? Here is how I'll say it. Number one, the hustler narrative and the hustler movement is about a class struggle, which has always been inevitable in this country. Whether or not a few political characters tried to hijack it or have, taken over in one shape, form, or another, the class struggle didn't start with them, and it will not end with them. I mean, when you look at the wider conversation about movements, there's a psychology of movements.
Right.
There's of course the politics of movements, which is what they have. There's the sociology of movements built around class struggle. The poor. You have the marginalized in there. You have young people who feel we are running a gerontocracy, which is basically a certain age clusters who only get to monopolize resources and state functions. So
right.
You have very many facets to what you would call our national this national class struggle that is going on, that will not be limited, neither will it end with the few politicians who are trying to hijack it for 2022. What I can tell you for a fact is that the class narrative, the hustler narrative, has been here. It will outlive them beyond 2022. And even between now and 2022, it will take on many functions and many models of existence beyond the two, the politicians who are trying it. So this is an organic ground up, you could call it a political, social, cultural, and even economic insurgency that has a life of its own. And much as they might, hijack, not entirely, but aspects of it for their own political expediency.
Right.
I would say for those who are in many ways opposed to its existence, they are misunderstanding the nature and character of this hustler narrative. It's not going away anytime soon. This country was always going to have a class struggle. It's always been here. It's simply coalescing around in a very unique way at this point in time. It could have happened in the 2022 itself. It could have happened in 2032. It could have happened in 2050. It could have happened even 40, 50 years from now. But either way, a class struggle was always going to be inevitable. Given the level of corruption, the level of creativity among our elites, their desire to centralize everything in a country of 50 million people and 582,000 square kilometers of land.
Right.
There was every
indicator,
historical indicator, political indicator, economic indicator, and vestiges of the colonial history that we have not resolved, that were creating the ground for a class struggle in this country. And so in many ways, this was near inevitable, if not outrightly inevitable. And so in that sense, then you can say that it will be hijacked in places here and there, but then its legacy has a minimum of 10 years in this country. Given that also, because of the age cluster of this country at 19 years, and because of the fact that the younger people tend to be poorer in this country than their fathers and their grandfathers, so it has a generational dynamic which gives it a staying power. It has a class dynamic which the elites have refused to fix. So this is going to be around for a while. Give it 10, 15 years. That's my modest estimation.
On that very, very high note, thank you, Darius, for indulging the elephant. Allow me perhaps in the future, as you said, in the next coming months, even as we get towards 2022, to invite you more as you said, since a movement, to keep on unpacking its various facets. So on that note, thanks.
My pleasure.
No problem. So on that note, thanks for having time to be with us here at the Elephant. Asante sana.
Much welcome.